Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Comp 10001, Foundations of Computing. My name's Nick Geard. I'm giving a guest lecture to you today. What I'm going to talk about today is, I guess, an application of computing that has definitely kept me interested in computing and motivated a lot of what I do over the last 15 or 20 years. I think it's a really exciting, really interesting, a really useful way in which computers can be used. And that is using computers as a tool to model, to simulate systems that we observe around us in the real world for various different reasons. So what I'm going to do today is introduce some of the concepts of modeling and talk a little bit about some examples of models, and particularly focusing on how we use models to make decisions about how we respond to pandemics. To begin with, just a little bit about who I am. I was born a long time ago in Hobart, Tasmania. I studied computer science, both undergrad and postgrad at the University of Queensland. I came to the University of Melbourne about 13 years ago. I started off in the School of Population and Global Health over in the medical faculty, and I joined CIS in 2016. I actually taught this subject, Comp 10001, from 2017 to 2021, so I've got a lot of experience with teaching Python. But currently I teach a couple of subjects that are in the Masters of Computer Science and Software Engineering. As I mentioned, my research area for most of my academic career has been in computational modeling and simulation. But ever since I joined the University of Melbourne 13 years ago, it's largely been focused around modeling the spread and control of infectious diseases. That was a relatively new area when I started working in it, relatively new at the University of Melbourne at least. And obviously over recent years, it's become highly topical and highly popular. So on that note, I want to start with just a little bit of scene setting. Who was in Melbourne, just out of curiosity, for the COVID pandemic in 2020? Anyone? A couple of people. In Australia? Internationally? Okay, so a lot of people were in various different places, but I think everywhere was affected to a fairly unprecedented degree by the experience of COVID. What we observed in Australia was we had very few cases at the outset of the pandemic. This is sort of the timeline over 2020. And very rapidly, we closed our international borders. So first we closed borders with China, where the pandemic started spreading, and then from various other countries where outbreaks started. And eventually we closed Australia's borders entirely. And this was very effective at preventing the introduction of the disease, but it was also very, very disruptive socially and economically. It meant people couldn't travel, people had to come home. A lot of businesses couldn't be conducted. And so it was quite an extreme measure to take. And even within Australia, a lot of borders were closed and opened and closed and opened over the course of the 2 years as we were able or unable to move between states. We used a lot of things like lockdowns and social distancing to try and reduce and limit the spread of disease. And for those of you who were in Melbourne, you will definitely not have forgotten this. Melbourne went into lockdown 6 times over the 2-year period. And by the beginning of October in 2021, Melbourne had the slightly dubious honour of having spent 245 days in lockdown cumulatively. And that was the longest cumulative time in lockdown for any city globally. So we spent a lot of time at home in that period, and a lot of time not going out and seeing people and interacting in the way that we would have liked to. Again, it was very effective, but it was very disruptive socially, economically, and also health-wise in other ways apart from disease spread. But then, towards the end of 2021, things changed. Lockdowns lifted. Australia opened its international borders. Life more or less went back to normal. What changed? Essentially, we had vaccination. So very, very rapidly, vaccines were developed. They were rolled out across the population, and this enabled us to have some confidence that we could reopen the borders, we could allow people to come into the country. We would expect there to be more disease spreading, but we wouldn't expect to have a lot of the harm associated with COVID because we had our population protected with vaccination. One of the questions that the government had at the time was, when would it actually be safe to open the borders? Obviously, the populations, the government wanted to open borders as soon as possible, but the last thing that they wanted after the Australian population had spent so long being affected by these measures to prevent transmission was to see a big outbreak when they opened the borders. And so they wanted to know, well, what is the point at which it's safe to open borders again? And so throughout the entire pandemic, but particularly at this point, there was a lot of focus on the use of models to try and understand how the disease was spreading, how it might spread in future, how different choices that we might make about things like vaccination, about opening borders, would affect the safety and the health of the population. And so I was part of a group working with researchers at the Doherty Institute primarily, but also other institutions across Australia, developing the models that helped inform Australia's plan for reopening its borders in 2021. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the background of these types of models, some of the types of questions that they can be used to answer today, just to give you a taste of this particular application of computing. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of modeling, talk about complex systems in particular, which is a specific type of system and a specific type of modeling approach, and then give you, time permitting, 3 examples of different models, and we'll work through some of these interactively. And then I'll come back at the end to talk about the models that we developed during the COVID pandemic in a little bit more detail. Okay, to begin with, what is a model? It's almost not a large enough audience for me to sort of ask for audience participation. To begin with, we're not talking about this type of model. What is a model? A model is basically a representation of some system in the real world, typically a complicated system that we don't understand very well, that we can use to try and understand that system better. If we look at the dictionary definition, a model is defined as a simplified representation of a system. It says here particularly a mathematical description, but we can broaden that to include a computational representation of a system as well. And we can use that simplified representation to understand things about the system that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. Okay, so why do we build models? They allow us to do things with systems that we couldn't do in the real world. Sometimes we might like to be able to try and run experiments in the real world to understand the behavior of the system, but it might be too expensive to do so. Say if we want to get millions of people to participate in an experiment and we have to pay them for their time, or we need to go out and use expensive scientific equipment to collect millions and millions of samples. It might be too time-consuming. If we want to try and understand something about the way continents are shifting around the Earth, or the way that mountains evolve, we can sit there and watch, but we'll be waiting a long time before we can collect enough data to be able to get good understanding. One of the things that we can do is we can model those systems in a computer mathematically. We can run that model much, much faster than reality, and we collect the data that we need to explore, to understand that process much more efficiently. In my area in particular, it might not be ethical to do experiments in the real world. If we want to understand something about how a disease spreads, we can wait for it to happen, and we can collect data, and we can observe and analyze and interpret and try and understand. But generally, we can't go out and deliberately release a pathogen into a population just to see what happens. Not allowed, not good. And some experiments just aren't possible. Some things that we might want to understand, we want to understand things about the way galaxies, solar systems have evolved over years. We can't go and run experiments on those. We've got one instance of history, and that's all we have to work with. With a model, we can explore lots of different counterfactuals about not just what did happen, but what might have happened. And also there is this idea that if we build a system, if we build some representation, we understand it better precisely because we have gone through that process of building it. And the types of models, there are various different types of models. I'm not going to go into detail. Statistical models, mathematical models, computation models. The models I'm particularly interested in are often termed mechanistic models. They're models that actually represent the dynamics of the system in a way that we think explains the behavior or causes the behavior that we observe in the real world. So we're really trying to understand not just what happened, but also why it happened. So how do we use models? There are a couple of different ways we tend to use them. Again, I'll sort of refer back to infectious diseases for the examples here. So we can use them to explain the past behavior of a system. If we've seen a disease spread through a population, COVID following its introduction or its sort of emergence in a particular location, why did it spread the way that it did? Why did this particular subset of people get infected while this particular subset of people didn't get infected? Why did it affect people who were this age group rather than that age group? And oftentimes here we might want to explore counterfactuals. Say we have responded to a disease. Say we've gone into lockdown and we've prevented the spread of disease. We might want to know, well, what would have happened if we hadn't have gone into lockdown? How many cases, how many hospitalizations, how many deaths might we have observed? We can't rewind time and go back and try and see what would have happened if we had have made a different choice. But we can use a model to try and set up, this is what did happen when we made this response. This is what might have happened if we hadn't have made that response. So explanation is often focused on the past. We also use models to think about the future and what might happen. It's often referred to as prediction. I don't really like that term because it makes me think of someone gazing into a crystal ball. I like forecasting because we think of weather forecasts. This is basically using models to make an estimate of what we think might happen on the weekend as far as the weather is concerned. And we use that to make a decision about whether we go to the beach or go to the movies. And this is a pretty common use of models. And the reason that we want to make these forecasts is so that we can be prepared, so that we can make decisions about how we might respond or how we might intervene to try and modify the system's behavior. Finally, we might want to use models to try and design some fundamentally new system, particularly a system that has particular characteristics or particular functionality. Okay, so in the same way that there are multiple different types of models, statistical, mathematical, computational, there are lots of different types of systems that we might want to model as well. Some of those systems are very static. We might have a model which is just a simple visual representation. A map can be considered a model of some area in the real world. A lot of the systems that we're interested, or that I'm interested in particular, are very dynamic. Their behavior changes over time. And I'm actually really interested in this class of systems referred to as complex systems. So complex systems have the specific characteristic that the behavior that they exhibit emerges from the interactions between lots and lots of different parts of the system. So if we think about a brain, the human brain is this amazingly complex system. It has this amazing functionality and ability to do stuff. But fundamentally, it's a whole lot of really simple computational units, neurons, all connected to each other in a really complicated way and all interacting with each other to produce thought, to produce cognition and consciousness. We see this being carried across as an inspiration for some of the really powerful models that we're using in computing these days. The neural networks that underlie large language models and various other machine learning techniques are a direct imitation of the types of neural networks that exist within our brains. Some of the other canonical examples of complex systems are things like social insect colonies. So an individual ant or an individual termite is quite a relatively simple sort of processing unit. But if we put a whole colony of termites together, they can build these amazingly complex structures with chambers and passageways, and they've been demonstrated to exhibit certain properties of thermal regulation so that the nests don't get too hot and too cold and so on. If we think about traffic, an individual car, an individual driver is making their own decisions. They're responding to the environment around them. But if we put hundreds and thousands of those cars all together, all trying to get into Melbourne CBD at 9 o'clock in the morning, we start to see behaviours emerge that couldn't be exhibited by a single car alone. A traffic jam requires a whole lot of cars. All of those cars are making decisions about when to slow up, when to slow down, when to change lanes, and so on. And the net result of that despite the fact that no one really wants it, is a traffic jam. Final one I come back to again a little bit, but if we think about the way that some species of birds and also fish behave, they exhibit this flocking behavior. And we get these amazing sort of visual patterns of large flocks of birds that have a shape and a characteristic all of their own. But we can't really isolate the role that a particular individual single bird plays in creating that shape. And they're not all getting together and planning to create this shape. It just happens as a result of them all interacting. So we'll come back to that one. And there are lots of other things that can be considered complex systems. Ecosystems, organisms with interacting cells, the internet with interacting computers all connected together in this distributed, decentralized fashion. Okay, so these are the sorts of systems that I'm interested in. And there's a particular type of modeling approach which is particularly relevant for simulating and exploring these systems, which is known as agent-based modeling or individual-based modeling. So let's explore a couple of examples of these, starting with some really simple models, and then we'll work up towards things that are a little closer to the types of models that we use to help provide advice to governments, make decisions about response to pandemics and other types of disasters. So the first one I'm going to introduce has been around for almost 50 years now, known as the game of life. I'm not talking about the board game here. This is a computational model of lifelike processes. And it's based on a particular class of model called cellular automata, which is a discrete, meaning that all of the elements in this system take on categorical finite values. It's a dynamic system. The state of the elements in our system change over time. It's defined by a very, very simple set of rules that only assume local interactions between all of these elements, but it can exhibit some amazingly complex behavior. Okay, so imagine this is a single automata. It's an element in our system. It has a state variable, x, and it has received some input. It then has a rule which changes the value of its state variable based upon the input and the current value of the state variable. Okay, so imagine this automata is a light bulb, right? And the light bulb is connected to a sensor. And what the sensor does is whenever it's dark and it senses there's no light, it switches the light bulb on if it's not on already. If it's on, it stays on. If it's light outside, then it switches the light bulb off if it's on. If it's off already, it just stays off. Okay, so we've got a very simple processing unit there. Now imagine that we've taken a whole bunch of these simple automata and connected them all together such that each of these x's now is operating independently. It's still switching on and off its light bulb, but it's now doing that in response to whether it's perceiving light from any of the surrounding automata. And straight away you can see that as you build up a larger and larger system of these connected automata, you might start to see some interesting patterns of behavior emerge as different lights switch on and off, and these affect the signals that the lights around them are receiving. Okay, so that's what a cellular automata is. A specific example of a cellular automata, and I should say, I guess, the original development of the cellular automata was back in the 1940s. So fairly famous mathematician and early computer scientist John von Neumann also did a lot of work in game theory, original sort of computational hardware, very, very broad and diverse. Worked on the Manhattan Project, for those who've seen Oppenheimer recently. So he'd invented this idea of cellular automata. He was really interested in this idea of self-replication. Ultimately, he wanted to have kind of robots or machines that could build copies of themselves. Because this is fundamentally what life is, right? It's an entity that creates copies of itself. So he was like, well, can we create this mechanistically? So he did some work back in the 1940s. In 1970, a British mathematician, John Conway, extended this idea and came up with a specific rule set that he thought exhibited lifelike characteristics. Okay, so the ingredients of this life model. We're going to have a two-dimensional grid of these cellular automata. So a little bit like the one we just had on the previous slide. just like on the previous slide, each of those cells is going to be on or off. For life, we'll call it alive or dead, but we'll represent those alive and dead cells as black and white cells just for convenience, but it's just a binary discrete state. We're now going to say that each of those cells is connected to all 8 of its neighbors. So, in this previous slide, we had just connected to 4 neighbors, left, right, up, down. We're now going to say it's connected to the diagonals as well. So every cell is connected to all of its neighbors. And we're going to say that all of these cells update at exactly the same time. So time is discrete in this model as well. It goes tick, 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 and the state of the system changes at each tick. And as per the previous slide, we're going to update the state of each of these cells based on its own current state and the inputs, the signals that it receives from its 8 neighbors. So that's the ingredients. The last thing we need is to define the rules of the system that specify how those states update over time. Game of life is very simple. It only has 4 rules. So just to explain the representation here, the white cells are the cells that are off. The black cell is a cell that's on or alive. The grey cells around the edges just to kind of indicate that the world that these cells occupy, the grid, is larger, but we don't care about the state of those cells. It's irrelevant for thinking about this central cell here. So if a living cell, the first rule of life is loneliness. If you've got a cell that's alive and it has fewer than 2 neighbors that are also alive, then it dies of loneliness. So here we go, this cell here, no friends. At the next time step, it's not going to be alive anymore. So as much as these cells don't like being lonely, they also don't like being overcrowded. If a cell has more than 3 living neighbors, then it also dies. So here we've got this cell in the center and it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 living neighbors. So at the next time step, it's going to die. On the other hand, if it has either 2 or 3 living neighbors, then it's going to stay alive. So this cell here has 1, 2, 3 neighbors. At the next time step, it's just going to stay alive. There's going to be no change. And the final rule of life is reproduction. How do we get new cells that are alive? If you've got a dead cell, a cell that's off, and it has exactly 3 living neighbors, then it comes alive. Don't ask me exactly what this model of reproduction corresponds to, but that is the rule of the game. Okay, so with those simple rules, what is the long-term behavior of the system? Okay, I'm going to explore this interactively, all going well, with a tool. Oh, that's not working. How do I share the right screen? Get out of here. Good. And then we'll go over to here. Let's make that a bit bigger. Okay, so NetLogo is a software package. It's been around for quite a while now, continually updating, still widely used. It's a very simple programming language. If you've learnt Python, you'll be able to write the logo code. And it provides a useful interface that allows us to interactively explore the behavior of these models. So what we've got here is our grid. You can't see the boundaries, but if I make some dead cells alive, we can start to see what that grid looks like. And what we can do is we can then tick forward, we can iterate time to see how the state of this system changes according to those rules. So if we go once, we'll see here nothing's happening. If we go forever, which means it just keeps running time forward, this is a stable structure, right? Each of these 4 cells that I've just created here has 1, 2, 3 neighbors. And what that means is it survives. So all of those cells are supporting each other and surviving. Not much happening. Okay, let's clear that. Let's look at another simple example. If we have 3 cells in a row, anyone like to hazard a guess as to what is going to happen when I click go once? We've got 1 cell on the end here. It just rotates backwards and forwards. Okay, yeah. Let's see. Okay, next time step. Okay, we've still got 3 cells that are alive, but it's now vertical rather than horizontal. And If we go again, it returns. So if we go forever, it just flickers backwards and forwards. To explain this, fairly simple. Each of the cells at the end here only has a single living neighbour, the cell in the centre, and so they're both going to die at the next time step. The cell in the centre has two living neighbours, so it's going to survive, and the cell to the left and the right of the centre cell has three living neighbours, so it's going to reproduce and come alive. So we can see we get this sort of oscillating system. And we can come up with various other structures that are stable or oscillating. A lot of the time, if we just go in and sort of, put together a random scatter of cells in some configuration, sort of run it for a little while, and it continues, and maybe there's some stable, and then eventually everything dies out. So we haven't got a sort of a self-sustaining system. We can also do things like we can set up like just a random screen, and we can set that running, and we can observe what's happening. And this is broadly what John Conway did back in the 70s. And I guess this is where he sort of got this idea that this is kind of like life. It's a bit like looking down at a petri dish through a microscope and looking at, watching sort of bacteria squiggling about and everything. And one of the things he observed, I don't think we've seen it here. Okay, so that's gone relatively quiescent now as we've just got some of these oscillators and some of these stable, different varieties of stable configurations. But one of the things that he observed, let's turn this off, was this particular pattern, which I'll create for you now. Oh, I'm going to get it right. Oops. Of 5 living cells like this. Okay, so this is quite an interesting pattern. Because if we look at what happens when when we tick forward time, so we get this pattern, still 5 cells alive. This pattern, still 5 cells alive. This pattern, 5 cells alive. And then at this point, we've actually recovered the original pattern that we started with, but not quite. It's actually shifted slightly in space. We can see this, if we click Go Forever, we've got this pattern which reproduces itself over time, but also translocates itself. And I think this is the point at which John Conway sort of looked down and thought, I've got life here. It's not quite, I've got this sort of thing going on. It doesn't have replication yet. There's just something which is persisting over time, it's moving around in a lifelike fashion. But it wasn't too long before he came up with structures slightly more complex with this one that were actually able to produce sequences of these. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm actually going to switch over to a video just because this shows a range of different characteristics of life. So here we've got 2 of those these are called gliders, by the way, one of the early sort of reproducing things discovered. If we let this run for a little while. Okay, so this is a specific characteristic or a specific pattern known as Gosper's glider gun after the person who invented it. Oh, what have we done? Stop, why are we getting ads? Okay, skip that. Yep, so Gosper's glider gun. And this is now very much more interesting because now we've got a pattern of living cells which is able to produce an effectively infinite stream of these glider patterns. So we've got something that is capable of reproducing itself. If we keep going and allow this to scale up a little bit more, we can put 2 of these Gosper's glider guns together, and we can produce streams of gliders that are interacting with each other. Here they're just interacting with each other in a way that brings about mutual destruction. But it also gives us the ability to build up higher order structures. So here we've got lots of gliders that are coming together, interacting in a way that creates a higher order self-replicating structure. These are somewhat imaginatively known as spaceships. And there's a whole field of enthusiasts dedicated to coming up with new patterns of ever larger and larger self-replicating, moving, mobile elements within this system. So we're just zooming out here. And this goes on and on and on. And it got to the point where people started getting curious about what are the computational capabilities of this system. And what this is showing here, I mean, we're zoomed out massively here. This is little streams of gliders moving around. is actually a Turing-complete sort of universal Turing machine. So it's conducting computation, not very efficiently, of course, but conducting computation using only that very simple set of 4 rules about very localized interactions. So we've developed a simple model which is able to produce phenomenally complicated behavior. Okay, we'll stop that here and move on. So that is definitely satisfied the criteria of what John Conway was interested in producing lifelike behavior. And as I say, people have now gone on to look at how you can use this as a form of computation, not so much because it's an efficient form of computation, because it demonstrates just how it's possible to obtain very complex behavior from very simple rules. Okay, so that's our first example. Second example, I want to come back to this idea of flocking behavior. And straight away, to illustrate that, a photo doesn't really do it justice. So I'm going to jump to another video just to give, for those who haven't had the joy of watching it, a starling murmuration is quite a phenomenal sight to behold. So species of bird, largely found in the northern hemisphere. These birds congregate in very large flocks, and they behave and interact with one another in a way that gives rise to these phenomenal dynamic patterns. And again, this is a great example of emergent behavior. If we think about what's going on here, it would be very, very difficult to write down, say, a mathematical or a verbal description of how these particular shapes, how these particular movement patterns are being produced. And yet, nonetheless, these relatively simple organisms obeying what we think might be some relatively simple rules about how they behave locally is producing these phenomenal, beautiful patterns of behavior. Okay, so how can we use modeling to understand the generation of this behavior? Over here. So Craig Reynolds, who was a computer graphics and animation expert back in the 1980s, did a lot of work with movie companies and software development companies, developed a model to try and, inspired by this idea of cellular automata and the game of life. Clearly we've got some different characteristics here, but he thought, well, can we come up with a simple set of rules that's able to reproduce this type of amazing behavior that we see in nature? And he came up with what he referred to as the Boyd's model of flocking behavior. I think this is kind of like birdoids back in the 1980s. So following the same pattern, the ingredients of the Boyd's model, we still have a 2-dimensional space. We can make it 3-dimensional as well, but let's keep it 2-dimensional to begin with. Space is now continuous. Rather than having this discrete cell-like structure, we're now going to consider space to be a continuous field, and we're going to model these agents, or the Boyds, that are moving around in that field. Each of those Boyds has state variables. One state variable is the location of the Boyd, where it is currently positioned in that space, and the second is its heading, which direction it's currently facing and which direction it's currently flying in. We're going to say that each of these agents, each of these Boyds, is able to sense the other flockmates that are around it, just within a given distance. So this is a representation of a Boyd here. The green triangle shows its heading. The gray area around it is the distance and also the angle that it's able to sense other Boyds in. I'm going to make these Boyds continuously update their direction, their heading, and keep moving forward based upon the local information that they receive about their surroundings. Again, just 3 very simple rules. First one for flocking behavior is separation. Birds don't want to collide with, or Boyds don't want to collide with other Boyds. So if they're getting too close, they'll adjust their heading to move away from nearby Boyds. For safety, birds or Boyds want to stay together. One of the reasons that these starlings are thought to exhibit this flocking behavior is that it means if there are predators around, an eagle, a larger bird, then it's better to be part of a large flock because the odds of you getting eaten by the eagle are much lower if there are hundreds and thousands of birds around you than if you're all by yourself. And similarly applies for a school of fish. And so the way that you stay together in a group is that you keep heading in the same direction. So you can observe those other birds that are around you, see which direction they're heading in, and adjust your heading so that you are moving in the same general direction as all of your neighbours. And then also related to this idea of safety in numbers, we've got the final rule of flocking, which is cohesion. That if you're sort of out by yourself and you can see that there are other birds over there, you want to change your heading so that you become closer to them. So all three of these rules are operating simultaneously. So let's go back to NetLogo again. And I should mention too, so NetLogo is totally freely available for download if you're interested in it, in this sort of thing. And it comes with this huge kind of library of different models that you can explore. So we want to get into biology and flocking. And so, yeah, highly recommend having a play around with it. Have I got that right? Okay, that's good. Okay, so let's hit setup. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of these boids here. We'll zoom out a little bit to get that on the screen. Colours don't matter too much, that's just so we can distinguish them a little bit, but you can see that each of them has a random location initially, and each of them has a random heading initially. And if we set them going, we see that they start moving around. We've got a variable which describes how far away they're able to see, just 5 patches, and we've got a couple of other variables that are associated with the rules that they're using. So how fast they can adjust their heading, and under each of these different rules for alignment, coherence, and separation. And what we see is that after only a minute or so of flying around randomly and updating their heading based on those rules, we start to see the emergence of coordinated bodies of these Boyd agents. And remember here, the remarkable thing about this, they're not quite as remarkable as the real ones in nature, of course, but it is only a simple rule set. But the remarkable thing about this is that there is no point at which an agent is sort of told, you have to be over here. There's no central point of control of this system. Every agent in the system is making its own independent decision based on its own local information. And these large-scale, macro-scale patterns of behavior that we observe are just an emergent consequence of all of those local individual decisions. And we can then play around with what happens if we change some of the values of some of these variables. So if we change the minimum separation, we can see that these Boids start to space out a little bit more. And depending upon how we change those heading variables, it will affect how rapidly they're able to recohere. Okay, so another example of the emergence of quite complicated behavior or quite complex behavior from a very simple system of rules. So I mentioned that Craig Reynolds, the person who invented these, was involved in the movie and animation industry. One of the early uses of these was actually in the movie industry, and so those Boids were used to create special effects in the Batman Returns movie in 1992 when they wanted to simulate large flocks of bats flying around in a location in a realistic way, but without actually having to release large numbers of bats into the environment. And since then, these types of methods combined with other tools from AI have grown increasingly sophisticated. And so if you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies or something, all of the battle scenes there where you've got thousands and thousands of orcs and dwarves and whatnot running around are largely all generated using some variant of this type of model that enables them to generate lots of interesting patterns of interaction between these different agents and then render that as CGI and come up with a realistic looking sort of battle scene for a movie. Okay, final model I'm going to talk about is coming back to disease spread. So again, a fairly simple model, susceptible infectious recovered model of disease transmission. This is really old. This has been around for 100 years. And it's still the foundation, the very simple foundation of a lot of the much more complex modeling work that we use today. The key assumption of this model is if we've got a population of people, we can treat them just in terms of their disease state. So we can say each person is either susceptible and they're able to be infected, they're currently infectious, meaning that they can infect others, or they have been infected, they've recovered, and that's given them some immunity against being reinfected, and so they're sort of safe. We then have some rules about how the states of those individuals change. So we're going to say, okay, if a susceptible person comes in contact with an infectious person, then there's some probability, some chance that that infection is going to transmit to the susceptible person, and you'll have two infected people. That's the first rule, infection. Second rule, final rule, recovery. We're going to say that an infectious person can recover at each time step with a certain probability, and that's going to give them protection against future infection. You know, for starters, we're just going to say that's permanent infection. They always stay recovered once they're recovered. We can then set up various assumptions about like, well, okay, what controls how people come into contact with each other? Because this is obviously a key driver of infectious disease outbreaks in real life. It's one of the reasons that measures like border controls and lockdowns are effective, because they change our patterns of behavior of who we meet and who we interact with, and hence we change how disease can spread. We often think about these patterns of interaction in terms of networks because they're a useful sort of mathematical formalism for representing population structure. So we say the nodes in those networks are the people, and the links represent contacts between people that could result in the spread of infection. So this is a model of spread of infection. It could also be considered, or it has been used as a model of how, say, a computer virus may spread through a computer network, and how information might spread through social media, for instance, how misinformation might spread, how rumors spread. So it's a very general type of model, but we're going to think about it here in terms of the spread of disease. Okay, so back to NetLogo one last time. And what we're going to use NetLogo for this time is to simulate, blow this up a little bit, the spread of disease on a network. Okay, so we've got our network here. We've got 200 nodes. Each of the edges between them represents the possibility of interaction and disease transmission. What we've done here is we've sort of connected all of them in a structure known as a circular lattice. So each of these nodes here around the edge is connected to all four of its neighbors, but then we've randomly also added a few edges across the network. I'm not going to go into the background of network models, but there are some sort of historical arguments of why this is a useful model of matching properties of networks in the real world, social networks in the real world. Okay, so we've set up our network. We're starting with a single infectious person in red here. If we spread once, we can see, okay, over time, there's a chance that they're going to spread infection to their neighbors. Okay, the white nodes here, I made these white rather than green because it suddenly occurred to me that anyone who might be red-green colorblind was going to not like red and green in the same plot. They're the ones who have recovered, so they can't be infected anymore. So it's only the red ones can infect the susceptible ones, the blue ones. So as we keep going, we can see that some of these long-range links have allowed the infection to spread to other parts of the population, and so on and so on. If we just hit this is like saying go forever. And we see that over time, what's happened is that a large chunk of the population has ended up infected and then protected against the disease, but not everyone. So there's a few boundaries here where these people recovered before they had an opportunity to spread infection to the rest of the population. Okay, and we can see on the edge here, we're just plotting the number of susceptible people in blue, which goes down over time, the number of infectious people, which goes up for a while and then back down again. I think most of you probably will have seen curves like this during COVID, where we're looking at sort of the dynamics of the disease over time. And green here showing the increase in the number of recovered people over time. Okay, so again, we can run this a bunch of times. We can see, okay, there, almost everyone got infected. Again. Okay, we've obviously got quite an infectious disease here that is continuously spreading. If we were to, say, reduce some of the probabilities here, so say we want to take our probability of infection and say, well, what if it's a bit lower than that? Let me set up a new network. Run again. Okay. So that with a lower probability of infection, the proportion of people who gets infected is slightly lower. And so we can sort of say, okay, well, how might we estimate what that probability of infection is for a particular disease, given what we've observed in the real world? And so we might take data on the observed epidemiology, and use that to calibrate our model so that it matches that reality. And we can then use that as a tool for understanding how we might intervene in future. The other point to note here is that this is a stochastic model, right? Each time we run it, we get a different pattern of behavior. If we think about what we observe in the real world is pretty non-deterministic and stochastic in many respects. But we only ever get to observe a single one of these runs. So with these models, we can look at the broader possibility of what might have happened as well as what we have actually observed. And we can then ask questions about, well, what might happen if we'd vaccinated a part of our population? Say, for instance, here I've set this percent vaccinated to 26, and we can see that 26% of the population begin white, so they're already recovered, they can't get infected. Let's put our probability of infection back up, and we can look at how this affects the extent to which a disease spreads through the population when we run it. So before, when we had no people vaccinated, a disease that was this infectious was spreading through most of the population. We vaccinate a proportion of the population, and our ability to contain the disease is increased. Okay, so lots more we can talk about in terms of disease spread on networks, but coming back to the opening point of this talk, modelling COVID, the key questions that the government were asking us to help them to answer was the level of vaccine coverage that would allow Australia to open safely or reopen safely. And then there were lots of subsidiary questions as well. We had a finite number of vaccines. Who should we be prioritising in terms of who we gave them to? Old people, young people. We'd also been doing lots of things like lockdown, contact tracing, quarantining people, isolating people. How much of that did we need to keep doing after we opened to prevent an outbreak from occurring? And then how much could we reopen? Could we let just as many people who wanted to come to Australia back in? So all of these complicated questions, and what this meant was we needed a much more complicated model to be able to answer these. So the actual model itself looked something more like this. We've got a more complicated representation of disease. So as well as susceptible, infectious, and recovered, we've now got an exposed class for people who are infected but not yet infectious, and they might not be showing symptoms. We've got people who are asymptomatic versus symptomatic, because that changes how they might change their behaviour. And we've also got a separate component of the model, or separate components of the model that handle who's getting vaccinated, and also the clinical outcome of someone who gets sick. One of the things that governments were very concerned about was the impact on the hospital system and overloading of the hospital system. So we're also using this model to represent what happened when someone got sick, went into the healthcare system, and so on. So we can provide the data with plausible data about different scenarios in a format that they can understand. The model was also much more complex because it needed to represent things about the demographic composition of this Australian population, where people were, how old they were, and so on. We had to have specific, more realistic patterns of social contact than just a random network. We had to have more complicated patterns of immunity than just saying someone was recovered, because someone's likelihood of getting infected would depend on how many vaccines they'd had, which vaccines they'd had, whether they'd been exposed to different strains of COVID in the past. It's all very complicated, so we need lots of data to sort of help inform this model. Okay. Not going to go through all of the details of the results, but effectively what this allowed us to do was to compare lots of different hypothetical futures in which we ran different vaccine strategies. So vaccinating oldest people in the population first, 40-year-olds first, all adults first, and so on. And do this for different levels of vaccine coverage, 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%, to determine where was that transition where the likelihood of there being an outbreak when we reopened was sort of low enough to be an acceptable risk, given the trade-offs in terms of the social and economic needs to sort of go back to normal. And so what we determined was that 80% vaccination coverage, which was what ended up being used, was likely to result in, yes, an increase of cases, but given the increase in vaccination, not a corresponding increase in the adverse effects of getting infected. And so that was the advice that was provided and more or less acted on. Okay, we've reached the end of the time, so I'm going to stop here. I will share these slides with the coordinator, Shannon, and so on, so that we can share them. final few slides just run through the point of saying, well, look, there are lots of different areas where this type of computational modeling is used, both for policy purposes to make decisions, but also for scientific purposes to try and understand something about the world around us. There's lots of intersections with different areas of computing in terms of AI, using large language models to generate agent behavior rather than these simple rules and so on. But the take-home message that I want you to go away with is that this type of application of computing, modeling, is both incredibly useful, it can literally save lives in certain contexts, but also that it's really fun. I often talk about playing with models as something that the students who work with me have to do to gain that intuitive sense of how this complicated system operates. And there's a pretty fine line between playing a game like The Sims or some complicated computer game and playing with a model of that's been developed for a scientific or policy purpose. If you are interested in this sort of area, then there's not much specific to this in the undergraduate curriculum here. However, lots of the skills that you will learn around programming and representation are incredibly relevant and useful for modeling. And by the time you get to masters, then there's a few subjects there around modeling and simulation, modeling software systems, AI planning, and so on. And I've also included a few links here, one to NetLogo and the other one to another sort of great introductory programming book that uses models to teach programming and visualization. So thank you very much. Hopefully that has been a little bit entertaining and shown you a new aspect to your possible future computing journey. Best wishes and best of luck for the rest of your Comp 10001 course. Thank you.